Thanks very much, Mark. And it's an absolute pleasure to have the privilege of chairing this first session this morning. I'd like to add my welcome to Mark. As Mark said, I'm a former president of this institution, was president for 8+ years, and very much enjoyed my time here in Ireland. In that role, I originally bid to host this general conference here in 2020. As we all know now, there were higher forces at work, which meant that that conference in 2020 had to be postponed, first of all to 2021. And many of you may have seen me in video promoting the conference, first in 2020 and then in 2021, and assuring you that you would be given a warm welcome in Dublin. So it's great that finally we can meet in person in Dublin, although I'm not hosting the conference, and Mark is the one hosting the conference. So it's great to see old friends and new friends here. I hope that so far your visit to Ireland has been great. I noticed the weather is being a little bit variable, but if you don't like the weather, just wait for an hour or so and it will change. So it's great, as I say, to be able to host this first session. This is the first in-person session now, I guess, for a number of years. Someone will remind me how many years it's been. 3 years since we've been together in person. So I hope that we will set the standard here for what is to come. Now, as you look at the stage, you see a lack of diversity in our panel members, but fortunately we have a panel member who is going to join us virtually, who is of a different gender to those the gender represented on stage. So we do have some diversity here. Now, this session is going to be on the transformative power of higher education. As we know, the basic structure and idea of university has survived for centuries, and Professor Rogers did refer to John Henry Newman, who was the first rector of what became University College Dublin, and the book he wrote on the idea of a university. So the ideas in that book, the ideas of many others, show how the idea of a university has remained remarkably consistent over the centuries. Yet universities themselves have been extraordinarily adaptable. And as we've seen through the pandemic, universities can really adapt to any change in the situation very rapidly and very readily. Universities have successfully been critical observers, mediators, and drivers of change at the same time, making sense of global complexities and proposing solutions to the challenges we face as individuals and societies. Over the years, the proportion of the population able to access a university education has been increasing very significantly, due both to an increased standard of living, but also due to increased rates of participation in primary and secondary education. While many professions require a university education, university graduates are overrepresented in all leadership roles in society. While the COVID experience has demonstrated the adaptability of universities, it's also demonstrated the level of inequality that still exists across the world, particularly in terms of access to computers and to the internet. Most universities in the developed world were able to move their students online relatively quickly and very effectively, but many universities in the global south found it much more difficult because their students didn't have access to the tools and the network that was needed to do that. Those of us that were able to bring our students online were also able to explore ways of internationalizing the student experience without requiring students to actually get on a plane and to travel. And this indicates that we have the potential going forward to internationalize the experience of students around the world who may not be able to afford to get onto planes and to undertake international travel. At the same time, to be able to internationalize the student experience without having a negative impact on the ecosystem, on the environment. Now, the pandemic also, I think, alerted us to the level of interconnectivity that exists in the world currently. and both the positive and negative aspects of that, as our transport systems saw the spread of the pandemic around the world at rates that have never been seen before in history. But at the same time, the international research system supported the development of effective vaccines at a speed that also has never been attained before. A key contributor to this development was the sharing of information, which was happening as quickly as discoveries were being made or data collected. So that brings us to the topic of today's session. So given the challenges that are currently facing society, what kind of changes in higher education are needed to create more equitable and sustainable societies for the future? How can we educate citizens and leaders who will contribute to the development of a peaceful, prosperous, and sustainable global society? I'm hoping that our distinguished panel of speakers will have the answers to these and other questions that we're grappling with. Our first speaker is our virtual speaker. Stefania Giannani has been serving as Assistant Director General for Education at UNESCO since 2018, making her the top United Nations official in the field of education. Stefania became a professor at the University for Foreigners in Perugia in 1991, advancing in 2004 to rector. She served as Italian Minister for Education, Universities and Research from 2014 until 2016, and was a member of the Senate of the Republic from 2013 to 2018. I'd love to welcome Stefania in person. Unfortunately, we will have her virtually by video. Over to Stefania.
Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be with you virtually at University College Dublin for this 16th General Conference of the International Association of Universities, UNESCO's most steadfast ally in the field. Well, today is also a celebration, as you were obliged to postpone this conference twice since the last one held in Bangkok in 2016. And the world has changed, dramatically changed since then, as we well know. The COVID-19 pandemic revealed the fragility, vulnerability of education systems across the world, and at the same time, their capacity to innovate and adapt. When it comes to higher education, economic strife, lack of access to technology, and isolation affected enrollment, studies, and research activity. The pandemic is compounded by multiple crises. The impact of climate change, the war in Ukraine more recently, and its ripple effects across the world, and the specter of a global recession, just to mention a few of them. It has set back progress across the Sustainable Development Goals that remain in and of themselves the most transformative and ambitious agenda yet adopted by the international community. Against this fragile and uncertain backdrop, we must hold firm to the principle that higher education is part of the right to education and the public good, a public common good, and a strategic force to steer progress towards more sustainable, fair, and inclusive societies. This year has been a turning point for the recognition of education and the lifelong learning as a transformative force for individuals, economies, and societies. But for these, education has to transform. This was the message, the very simple, clear message of the Transforming Education Summit, convened, as you all know, by the UN Secretary General last month, that elevated education on the political stage in an unprecedented way. It was as much a response to the deepening education crisis as a call to transform the how and the what of learning. In their national statements of commitment, 40% of countries reference universities as a space of innovation, experimentation, and ideation. For universities to fully play their role as institutions learning, research, and service to society, they must continue to democratize access and knowledge. It's in this spirit of transformation, of innovation, that close to 2,000 participants from circa 140 countries attended the third World Conference on Higher Education in Barcelona last May this year. The conference pushed traditional boundaries, bringing together academics, students, teachers, civil societies, employers, and more to chart the course for higher education in the decade ahead. A more inclusive and collaborative course oriented around the daunting challenges of sustainable development. Our vision, based on extensive consultations, inclusive consultation, is actually crystallized in a roadmap entitled Beyond Limits. This roadmap sets out 6 major transitions that I believe can help to enrich and hopefully inform your discussion in this general conference. Let me briefly summarize and run you through them. First, from exclusion to inclusion, higher education is part of the right to education and the common public good with all the implications this carries. Second, from a discipline oriented towards a holistic approach that encompasses academic, professional, and citizenship dimensions. Third, from a silos methodology to a transdisciplinary approach that encourages open dialogue between diverse perspectives and points of view. Fourth, from a terminal incremental approach to a lifelong learning model. 5, from a hierarchical model, one size fits for all within institutions, towards a flexible, agile, diversity-based model. 6, from a content-based approach to a transformative one, putting technology at the service of effective teaching, learning, and research. I know it's an ambition roadmap, but I also know that in addition, UNESCO Global Independent Expert Group on the University and the 2030 Agenda, we can identify direction to better connect learning to the stakes of a sustainable future, and we can do this job together. These dovetail with the transitions that I just outlined. They stipulate that universities need to go beyond the disciplinary boundaries, beyond limits, diversity knowledge, and expand partnerships. More than ever, we need both science and the humanities to strengthen democratic cultures, to nurture critical mindsets, to help students navigate complexity. This is not a new topic, of course. I come from a country, Italy, where Leonardo da Vinci, many centuries ago, already identified this kind of approach. Now, collaboration and solidarity are the 2 main dimensions we have to work on, expanding higher education systems where they will be needed most in the decades ahead to share knowledge and co-create solutions. UNESCO promotes this through its network of Unity UNESCO chairs, encompassing now some 850 institutions in more than 100 countries. And this is a kind of way to implement collaborative and interdisciplinary approach, and it's about celebrating this year the 30th anniversary next month with a big conference here in Paris on transforming knowledge and working on the sustainable future. The boost research capacity and with sharing scientific data can really give us the way to implement global citizenship at university level as well as education system level. To promote academic mobility and strengthen research cooperation, our regional conventions are now complemented by the Global Convention, adopted by member states 3 years ago at the General Conference of UNESCO. And now, this month, it only needs 2 more ratifications before entering into force. To sum up, higher education has an ethical and societal responsibility to open up to society, to foster an ecology of learning that nurtures civic engagement and to better connect research and policy for the common good. I really deeply encourage everyone in attendance today to reflect on how you and your institutions can take action to lead these transitions. I wish you an excellent session and conference, and certain regret, unfortunately, not being able to join you in person in Dublin. Thank you very much.
So our next speaker for this session will be Professor Antonio Noboa, and he's the chair of the Research Drafting Committee of the UNESCO International Commission on the Futures of Education. His life as a university professor began at the University of Geneva as an assistant in 1982. In 1986, he entered the Faculty of Psychology and Educational Sciences at the University of Lisbon and became a full professor in 1996. In 2016, he was an independent candidate in the presidential elections and obtained 23% of the votes. From April 2018 until November 2021, he was the permanent representative of Portugal to UNESCO. Professor Novoa, the stage is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this invitation, for the invitation of the International Association of Universities. Thank you very much also for the reception here in the University College of Dublin, inviting me to speak in this session on the transformative power of higher education. I will not insist before you on the idea of transformative power, because everyone here knows and recognizes this power. But I need to say that to accomplish this power, their transformative power, universities need to transform themselves. It's about the transformation of universities that I want to speak, in line with the reflections produced at the last Transforming Education Summit at the United Nations, where the Secretary General say the Transforming Education Summit will seek to renew our collective commitment to education and lifelong learning as a preeminent public good. Is online with these reflections, but also, and I would say mainly, with the latest UNESCO report, Reimagining Our Futures Together, a new social contract for education. But first, allow me to address a shift in higher education over the last 30 years, when what some of us call the modernization agenda of universities became dominant. This agenda, very present, for instance, in the famous Bologna process, obviously had positive aspects, but it was based on a wrong idea of what universities are or should be. In a certain sense, this agenda started in the 90s with the massification of higher education and the recognition of, and I'm quoting a very famous British economist, the recognition of the economic value of universities. It's not only about the economic impact of universities, but about their own economic value of universities. From here, well-known discourses and policies became dominant, repeated over the last 30 years in political texts by international organizations and also in the strategic plans of universities. A kind of a new, almost universal language was created to talk about higher education and its modernization. We know well these ideas. We all know well these ideas that have spread throughout the field of our education all over the world. We all say these words that I'm going to recall now. In a very schematically way, it is possible to define this language, the language of modernization of universities, in 4 words, beginning with an E and repeated ad nauseam in recent decades in higher education. The first one, it's employability, and its twin concept, lifelong learning, narrowing higher education, mainly in terms of qualifications, STEM, human resources, and entry into the labor market with approaches mainly inspired by human capital theories. The second word is excellence. Excellence to clearly mark competitiveness with processes of accountability and accreditation, giving rise to increasingly powerful rankings and unifying tendencies and a productivism, an academic productivism that has come to define academic life and academic careers. The third word is efficiency, defining above all as a managerial efficiency, bringing market rules, corporate processes, and privatization dynamics into universities, and also creating, in the last decades, a powerful global higher education industry. The last one, and very powerful, is of course entrepreneurship, as a way to link universities with society and economy, above all through the transfer of technology and all kinds of startups, but also legitimizing extreme forms of precariousness of work in academia and in society. Many of these developments brought a new awareness of university issues and debates and shook universities, forcing them to break with inertia, with enclosures, and with some ways of doing that were not the right way. But in a general assessment of these 30 years, we can say that above all, these developments contributed to decharacterize universities and brought about difficulties that, to a large extent, led to a certain loss of meaning and even to a malaise on the part of the universities and their students, their professors, and their researchers. Of course, it was already recalled here, we cannot ignore that the pandemic also contributed to this situation, namely with the physical distancing and an indiscriminate use of digital devices, which, if maintained, would jeopardize the very idea of university. But the truth is that the problems of universities precede the pandemic tragedy. The UNESCO report on the futures of education is not mainly addressed to higher education. Perhaps the time has come to write another report dedicated only to higher education. But even so, this report leaves important clues for thinking about higher education and concludes each of its main chapters with a strong reference to universities. It says, right at the beginning, universities and other higher education institutions must be active in every aspect of building a new social contract for education, from supporting research and advancement of science to being a contributing partner to other educational institutions, to being a contributing partner to other educational institutions, I underline, and programs in their communities and across the globe, universities that are creative, innovative, and committed to strengthening education as a common good have a key role to play in the futures of education. In my personal, strictly personal interpretation, this report contains answers to an agenda for the transformation of universities that goes beyond the modernization agenda and that can strengthen the transformative power of universities. To identify this response of a transformative agenda, I use the same 4 words that I have used before. Employability. Yes, but we need a broad education from a scientific and cultural point of view, a pedagogy of cooperation, of encounter, of human relationship. We need, above all, to design new educational environments, new education ecosystems where we can educate together with each other, where we can work together, where we can build education together. Turning to the digital, certainly, but the digital will never replace the human dimension that marks any educational and pedagogical relationship. A higher education, just for employability, would be a lost education. This is what the UNESCO report tells us. Excellence, yes, but without forgetting the need to link research and teaching, science and humanities, the need to value collaboration between professors, promoting convergence, transdisciplinarity, open science, citizen science. A transition from the cogito to the cogitamus. Hyperspecialization, also caused by hyperproductivism, has to be replaced by work around the knowledge commons. In this sense, the metrics and evaluation methods of universities and scholars must be more diverse and plural, welcoming and valuing the difference, both between universities and within each university. These are ideas from the UNESCO report. Efficiency, yes, but always strengthening the idea of the university as a place for participation, for citizenship. If we want to build a common humanity, we must have institutions where this common can be produced and reproduced. Work in common, life in common, dialogue, plurality of voices, a convivial society. It is one of the most decisive roles to be played by universities. Universities must be institutions of freedom and participation, where one learns to value and to build the common. The university serves, of course, to enrich our personal life, but also our collective life. It is in this sense that the UNESCO report defends the principle of education and also of higher education as a public and common good. Entrepreneurship, yes, but the university's service to society cannot be seen only from a technological or business point of view. The most important issue is the university's public commitment to the city, to the polis, and innovation, of course. It is the presence of universities in the public space, also in decisions about our common future. It is, in this sense, that the UNESCO report speaks of a new social contract for education, a new social contract for education in which higher education plays a fundamental and critical role. There are more than 250 million students worldwide, 250 million that can make a difference to a more diverse, more plural world where each person can be what he or she wants to be a world at peace with the earth and at peace with others. These are, dear colleagues, some of the ideas that run through UNESCO's latest report on the futures of education. At the end, there is a call for innovation and research, leaving an appeal to universities and their capacity for creation and knowledge. One thing is sure: to be able to fulfill these missions, universities need to be different. Different from all other institutions. This is their strength, their identity and strength. This is their relevance and value to future society. The big mistake in the modernization agenda of universities was to make them similar to other institutions, especially business ones. This was harmful for universities. The great transformation of universities, of the transformation agenda of universities, is to stress their difference between institutions and other institutions, difference between universities, difference within each university, namely in the life of each student, in the life and career of each professor and researcher. The future of universities is also defined in a different relationship with time. The agenda of modernization has dragged universities towards the short time, towards immediate accountability, towards the short time of employability, of excellence, of efficiency, of entrepreneurship. But it is in the slow and long time that the true value and usefulness of universities is found. A time to cultivate doubt, to act together, to make mistakes, to act differently, to give maturity to thought, to inspire imagination, to build collective forms of action and participation. And this needs time, a different relationship with time. For that, dear colleagues, we need to follow the advice of Simone Weil many years ago, in 1943, in a letter that she addressed to her professor, the philosopher Alain. And I quote, "What I would like," says Simone Weil, "is to launch an appeal to all those who know or actually do something and for whom it's not enough to know or to do, and they want to reflect on what they know and on what they do." It is this kind of collective capacity for reflection that our future lies. It is in this collective capacity for reflection that our future lies. Therefore, the UNESCO report ends not with the usual recommendation, but with an invitation to educators from all over the world to mobilize collectively in projects and experience, to think and to act together. It is not worth waiting for a new reform or a new theory or a new method or a new technology. It is worth working together, having the courage of beginnings, as Vladimir Jankelevich told us. This ambition should lead to important changes in universities. On the one hand, internally, creating open environments of common work, of innovation and citizenship, of participation. On the other hand, externally, assuming education as a public and common good, as a global common good, as a global responsibility, like health, we all depend on everyone's education. And allow me to end by recalling a beautiful initiative by the University of Cambridge on the occasion of its 800th anniversary in 2009. Vice-Chancellor Alison Richard wrote to 800 personalities around the world, inviting them to write a letter to the future. I was also invited, and I agreed to write a letter to the person who would occupy my position, rector of the University of Lisbon, 100 years later, in 2109. I received the kit with a pen and a special paper. I wrote the letter, which is kept secure and secret in Cambridge, and which the University of Cambridge undertakes to deliver to my successor at the University of Lisbon in 100 years from now. It is a nice initiative. Some might see a certain sign of arrogance on the part of universities here, writing for such a long time, but not. It is a sign of trust and commitment. A couple of months after writing the letter, I found myself thinking, what if? What if I already start doing what I predict in the letter? And so I did. In a sense, this General Conference of the International Association of Universities is a letter to the future. What if, after writing this letter, we started to do in our institutions what we have written during these days here in Dublin? Maybe the universities would get a little better and the world too. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Nova, for a very interesting and challenging talk, and I'm sure that will stimulate a lot of discussion. Our next speaker is Professor Kiyoshi Yamada, and he's served as Chancellor of Tokai University in Japan since 2014. He's been a Professor of Economic Law at Tokai University since 2004. Professor Yamada became Executive Director of International Affairs in 2003 and Vice Chancellor for International Affairs in 2009. He holds a doctorate in information policy from Tohoku University. Professor Yamada is going to, I think, speak from his, oh, you go here? So he will speak from here. Unfortunately, Professor Yamada will have to depart afterwards to go to the airport and so won't be able to participate in the discussion. But Professor Yamada, the stage is yours.
Thank you for kind introduction. It is my honor to give my speech on the occasion of IAU General Assembly today. I expected to join this meeting from 2018, but couldn't do so today. I am very happy to be here in person. And today's topic is value of the university for to future society. I would like to say a few words about my idea, what is the value of the university to the future. Before starting my presentation, I just introduce our university, focus on our founder. Our founder was an engineer before World War II, and he invented long-distance telecommunication system. And he believed this technology contribute to the world harmonization. But contradictory, this technology, this system was used for warfare because of the headquarters and front. Long distance telecommunication is very useful for war. So, and he regret, and by having award money, he decided to establish the university just after World War II. So this is our university's foundation. Our mission is to the person who contribute to the world peace. So, and he was so impressed by the European educational system, especially in Denmark. And he visited the Folk High School, and he needs to this idea for Japan to reconstruct after World War II. So, and our university, very small one, but now student body is around 30,000. So we established the institute in the suburb of Copenhagen. So I excuse myself to leave after this presentation, have to visit to this institute this afternoon. And we organized the Asian Pacific University President Conference from 1985 to 2002. Just before the World War end, our university wanted to contribute to the Cold War end. So 21st century, we believed Cold War is ended. So we didn't continue this conference. But now we believe the necessity of this kind of conference is very important. Professor Shinya Yoshimi, who is the former vice president of the University of Tokyo, and I myself did a talk about what kind of contribution to current serious profound situation. And he pointed that the university is the kind of travelers organization. In the past, the beginning of the university, a student and the professors hanging around the place and to get the knowledge place to place. So COVID-19 prevent us to do such activity, and kind of isolation leads the authoritarian government, I believe. So I think that the currently, since the COVID-19 restriction is smaller, we have to restart the circulation or the excursion of the students for so-called future personnel. And we have 6 campuses all over Japan, north to south. And also in Hawaii, we have a campus. So it's very difficult in Japan, the student mobility. Once a student entered one university, almost all of them graduate the same university. Not only the faculty's liquidity, but also the student liquidity is very, very small, very exceptional. And I try to send a student to not only our university, but also other university all over the world. However, the student also reluctant to do this removable. And so, I'm now considering the kind of excursion education for our campus, because we have 5 campuses all over Japan. So, because of distance education is much more developed than before. So the student hanging around our 6 campuses 1 term or 1 semester. This attempt is very difficult as such a big scale university like us. 30,000 students, it's very difficult. However, the step by step, I want to do this attempt. And we have a board. You can see this board is basically research board. However, we put the 100 student and cruise 1.5 months. By taking this experience, student grow, student much matured. So, and this is also a small amount. However, we want to do the small college doing as a big scale university. The conclusion. The origin of the university is a community of knowledge where those who travel come together on their journeys. Should we perhaps go back to where it's all began? I believe student migrating excursion between the campuses and expanding the knowledge across the borders is one of the effective ways to develop a global citizenship. And the liberal arts education, regardless of the field, will become even more important. Then we can foster those who will contribute to the world peace as a global citizen. I want to emphasize all participants today, please send a student other place. And by doing this, they can get aware that the importance of the diversity or importance of the world peace. So, and on such a critical situation, we would like to continue, and we would like to do effort to realize this mission. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Yamada. So our final speaker before we go to a more general discussion is Sebastian Berger. He's the Executive Director of the Global Student Forum. He's previously held the office of Vice President in the European Students' Union and was a founding member of the GSF Steering Committee. Sebastian has been an active member of the international student movement for years. He's also currently the co-chair of the Education and Academia Stakeholder Group in the UN. Welcome, Sebastian.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction and good morning. Let me also start with expressing my gratitude to the IAU for the invitation, for the opportunity to contribute to this panel on behalf of the organized international student movement that is umbrellaed within the Global Student Forum. As a matter of context, just very quickly, the Global Student Forum was founded in June 2020 by the All African Students Union, the Commonwealth Students Association, the European Students Union, the European Organizing Bureau of School Student Unions, so this is the organization for secondary students, and the Latin American, Continental and Caribbean Student Organization as the formal unification of the world's largest pre-existing student organizations. And through our 202 members from 122 countries and territories, we represent the independent and democratic voice of approximately 200 million learners towards the international community and the education sector polity. So much about the organization I represent. Let me now move on and try to give some insights concerning the question that was posed as a framing to my contribution, which is the transformations that we as students want to see in terms of achieving a more sustainable and equitable society. I'm gonna base my analysis and proposals on agreed policy of the international student movement in the run-up to the UNESCO World Higher Education Conference. Earlier this year, we have undergone an extensive consultation effort involving 90 national delegations of students to draft a commonly agreed declaration. And that draft was then further consulted with the entirety of our membership and adopted as the formal recommendation for the future of higher education from the students' movement's perspective. The QR code on the screen, if you're interested, if you catch it with your phone, should take you to that paper. It's a comprehensive document of 80 policy suggestions, so I won't be able to touch upon all of them. But I will try to highlight some of the key issues in the next few minutes that were identified and share potential pathways for action that probably do not seem new to you. They have been heard many times before, they seem standard, but unfortunately they remain under-delivered in many instances. Throughout the regional consultations, countless issues were raised, but it became more and more evident and clear that they can be roughly grouped under one or multiple of the fundamental existential crises that we are facing. If we look at the IPCC's latest report, we could not see more explicit warnings. We are heading for a mass extinction of species, including our very own, due to damage to vast habitats and the livelihoods of billions of people. With the most vulnerable, who have contributed the least and are also in the worst position to adapt to it, paying the highest price. And we have to look at what happens at COP27, but developed nations at the moment are still failing to phase out fossil fuels fast enough, resulting in ever more intense and escalating climate disasters. The second dimension at the heart of our discourse within the student movement is deeply interlinked with the first one. It's a crisis of excess and scarcity, of immoral and unimaginable wealth concentrated in the hands of a few, while so many struggle to make a living and live a dignified life, both within domestic economies and if you look at the international system, which keeps reproducing breathtaking poverty and inequality through extractivism, through austerity, and a deeply biased international financial architecture. The third dimension relates to democracy. We have seen an unprecedented backslide in democracy unfolding in front of our eyes over the last 2 decades. Authoritarian leaders and oppressive forms of government enjoy a renaissance in many parts of the world, and students often stand on the front line when it comes to the protection of civil liberties, freedoms, human rights against the backdrop of those and the repression of those who want to see abolished in their own interest. Now, the question is, in all of this, what is the role of higher education? We heard it before, education is the most powerful tool to bring forward impactful and lasting change. And we believe that it's the foundational responsibility of universities and higher education specifically to educate learners and the future generation of leaders that become capable of creating a more equitable and inclusive future for everyone. As this key enabler for the transition to a more sustainable world, higher education institutions need to be publicly and sufficiently funded to do the necessary work, to conduct the necessary research that helps governments and the private sector to implement practices that respect and protect the environment and our planet. And we are convinced that education for sustainable development needs to be taught across curricula, from early childhood all the way up to higher education. There is no quality education. We cannot talk about quality education leaving out educational sustainable development at this point of time. And educators therefore need to be provided with resources, with the necessary training, including a focus on lifelong learning and creating upskilling opportunities, supporting those, and there will be many, many more in the future, who have to undergo the transition from unsustainable to more green jobs. Another important factor is the role model function of higher education. Universities need to be lighthouses for other sectors of society. And unfortunately, if we look at the Race to Net Zero campaign, only 3% of higher education institutions have so far signed on to that framework. Since this is a space with many institutional leaders, I left you the link here on screen if you want to learn more about this initiative. Divestment also concerns universities and their assets, opting out of fossil fuel investments and making sustainability a decisive factor in ethical guidelines within institutions and when it comes to procurement deals. So we need a multidimensional approach that ranges from teaching and learning to operations and investments for higher education to step up its effort in mitigating the extent and the impact of the crisis. Moving on to inequality, to quote Professor Charles Hopkins, and President Deeks was also mentioning it before, 80% of leadership positions are taken up by higher education graduates, yet only 6% of the people worldwide go to higher education. Or in other words, higher education is opportunity, it's social mobility, and it's a chance to transform society. However, it unfortunately remains a privilege for the few. Most people still don't have access to it. And coming from a belief that unjust economic and political realities are reproduced and upheld by an unjust and unrepresentative allocation of power in politics and society, equitable access to higher education can shift that power and transform socioeconomic realities lastingly. Therefore, higher education must be made accessible to everyone, regardless of financial background, disability, gender, race, sexual orientation. A rights-based approach is needed to minimize discrimination and to equip and support vulnerable groups, including political, ethnic, and religious minorities, refugee communities, and indigenous people to obtain higher education via flexible pathways, recognition of prior qualifications, affirmative action, and targeted subsidies that break down economic barriers. In parallel, curricula need to be remodeled to include a more direct linkage, and we heard that, with entrepreneurship, with skills, with vocational training, to attract a more diverse student body. And last but not least, our education systems and systems need to be decolonized and indigenized to include local sensitivities, traditions, cultures, and more critical worldviews. By incorporating previously marginalized and excluded voices and pedagogies, higher education can create an environment that allows more people to question persisting imperial practices and the appropriation of resources and labor from the global south to sustain an illusion of everlasting economic growth in the Western world. The third dimension relates to democracy. Higher education institutions have historically been places where critical thinking is developed, even in hostile political and institutional environments, where academic freedom and institutional autonomy are being challenged, are being under attack. At its core, higher education needs to empower and protect the rights of all citizens to become active citizens, exercising self-determination, involving themselves in civic discourse with students and teachers, thinking and working freely. But to allow this, we need to safeguard the freedom from social, political, cultural, and economic interference, censorship, and imposition on academia, as we see it in so many countries nowadays. But we also need to be vigilant when it comes to ensuring that universities and higher education systems do not become complicit in suppressing academic freedom and fundamental rights. Sustaining democracy at the local, national, international level requires it to be practiced throughout all sectors of society, and that very much includes the academic community. A collegial approach to higher education, governance, and policy must take the concerns and aspirations of all members of the academic community into account and facilitate access to relevant decision-making spaces for the legitimate elected representatives of each group that is represented within this community. Only when students, departments, staff, faculty recognize that sharing the governance of a higher education institution is a common responsibility can the vital deliberations and the collective dialogue take place, leading to long-term decisions in the strategic interests of all parties involved. Meaningful student participation must therefore be regarded as a fundamental value and a pivotal building block of institutional democracy, but also educational quality, since nothing can replace the first-hand insights and experiences that students bring to the table. To slowly wrap this up, the future of higher education, this new social contract that is so much talked about, that students want to see is one in which higher education, quality higher education is accessible to everyone and free of charge. It's a future in which higher education institutions empower democracy and human rights by supporting learners to become active and critical thinkers, active global citizens with compassion for their fellow human beings, for the nature and the planet. And it's a future in which the higher education community undertakes every humanly possible effort to turn the tide on climate change so that the generation of students that comes after us has a future at all. The transformations necessary to achieve this are costly, they are complex, they are systemic, but we can't continue with more of the same, this is clear. The student movement is organized on the institutional, on the national, on the regional, and the global level, and we want to be partners in this process of transformation. It can only be done if the whole sector works together, and I'm very much looking forward to the discussions ahead of us and want to thank you for your attention. It's a privilege to speak to so many sharp minds gathered in one room, and I think it's a great opportunity to come up with good solutions. So in that spirit, thank you very much, and back to you, Mr. President.
Okay, so I think you'll agree that we've heard a fantastic vision for where we want universities to go. Perhaps I can kick off a discussion in terms of and how do we achieve this. With some other members of the board of the IAU the other night, we were discussing the membership of university councils or boards. Because for a university to transform in the way that we've heard described, then there clearly needs to be leadership from the highest level. But as well as the membership of the board or the governing authority, what we do see is increasingly around the world, governments taking an interest in what universities are doing and how they're conducting their operations. So the mention of public funding, of course, public funding is increasingly coming with strings and with governments putting in place agencies to oversee what universities are doing, to agree performance metrics for universities, many of which would be along the lines that we've heard in terms of efficiencies, employability, etc. So I wonder if I could ask the members of our panel first, and then I'm going to go to the audience to say a little bit about what we need to do to put in the enablers at the government perspective level and at the board level of universities that would allow these visions to be achieved.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yes, you talk about leadership, which obviously very, very important for the transformation of universities. But I would like to put together with the idea of leadership, the idea of participation, because sometimes in many countries, and we talk about the modernization agenda of universities again, when we talk about leadership, is to diminish participation. And what I would like to see in universities is leadership with participation, with more participation. And I think that the engagement of not only students, professors, researchers, but the whole city that is around what I call the polis in terms of the Greek definition is obviously very important for me to define this leadership. So yes, the boards of universities, they need to have this plurality of voices, but in a context of democratic and participatory institutions. And that's for me very important. And that's not what has been happening in the last decades. I think that we are losing in the last decade this sense of participation, of civic engagement inside universities. And that's for me, it's absolutely crucial if we want to have leadership, strong leadership, but democratic leadership.
Working? Yes, this is working. I think picking up on what you were saying about the kind of perception of what a successful university is, the indicators, and also governments tying funding to certain expectations of institutions. I think it's a question of what do we perceive as a successful university? What is it? Is it rankings, as it was said before by Professor Nova? Is it community impact? Is it how many publications a university is able to put out in a year? And I think that's the fundamental question that we need to rethink. I do think that when we talk about successful universities, it's not about excellence solely, but rather the impact that universities have on the community, how much they give back, how much the public responsibility in the third mission are at the center of the efforts. And I think that is very much tied to a general neoliberal kind of approach to how our world works. In that sense, I think we really need to reflect and question the fundamental metrics of how we measure success at the moment. And all that is tied to that in terms of funding, in terms of how we structure our institutions.
Okay, thank you. Look to the audience for comments in terms of government strings that are tied to funding of universities, and perhaps experiences that you have in your country, and what you think we might be able to do, even as an association, to lobby for the autonomy of universities and to get away from this economic imperative that some governments seem to see in the performance of universities.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I would like to congratulate our speakers for their very interesting presentations. I come from Latin America, particularly from Mexico, but because of the job I have as a Secretary General of the Association of Latin American and Caribbean Universities, I'm part of IAU, I'm a member of the board. I would like to say that this problem that Andrew was mentioning of the strings that governments want to put into universities is a very grave situation in that part of the world. Particularly, I would like to say, in Brazil nowadays. The present government of Brazil is attacking and very strongly the universal institutional autonomy of universities, and wants to impose a model of thinking which is the main enemy, for universities contributing, to the progress of society. I think we should call that attention and raise our voice in defending particularly Brazilian universities, because I think the present government wants to wipe out, public universities, particularly the federal universities. So I want to stress that, and I hope that next Sunday things change in that country. Secondly, I would like to say that I fully agree with Professor Noboa that the present universities that we have at the moment are limited, are not good enough, I mean, to really contribute to what society needs. So I think that is something extremely important, but extremely difficult. Universities are a place, is a very plural place, I mean, for critical thinking and so on, but difficult to transform. So I think the universities that we have now divided into faculties and institutes and so on, with a lot of specialization, are not good enough for attacking the complex problems that we have. That's an urgent need that a biologist, for instance, knows what is happening in which country, in which world, in which what is the social context in which he's working. So I think that's something extremely important that I wanted to mention. Thank you.
Thank you. I think Pam had her hand up, and we've got one back here.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inspiring presentations. And I'm Pam Fredman, the president of the IAU, and I would like to start with saying, coming up to what also Roberto said as you, Apenta, we could not collectively say what the universities are today because there's such a diversity. Therefore, I think it's so important that we do meet around the world, share knowledge, share experience, and all share those issues that we see in different countries and how we can help each other. So, and then to the, how do we do with the government? I'm coming from a country, Sweden, where we actually do have public funding mainly for the university. We don't have private universities, so it's another situation. But still, we are seeing the rankings, we are seeing the merits and all these counting assessments from the government, which is critical. In my view, and maybe you will explore that, it is important that we actually work much more closer to the society, to the different stakeholders, because if they support higher education, if they are standing behind the higher education, I think that there is much more trust in the governments to give the money and give trust for the higher education institutions to develop. The third thing, we have to live the values within the university, being a little bit self-critical. Are we democratic? Are we living up the values? I'm not sure. We have, when it comes to students, I think it's very important that we protect curricula. There is threats to curricula, and even among students, there are threats to curricula. For scientists, do they follow the ethical, the equality values when they do the research? And we have seen not just threats to researchers, it is horrible. On the other hand, often we can see researchers threaten or putting very hard arguments on another researcher, and that is not academia. We should be critical, we should argue, but we should also live that we accept and we see diversity and we are tolerant. So that's my input.
We've got three now.
Thank you very much. Until February, I was head of the education department at the Council of Europe, which is a pan-European intergovernmental organization. Thank you very much to the panel, not just for talking about change, but as Sebastian Berger's initial question was, what kind of change or transformation? I can assure Professor Noah that many of those of us who have been working within the Bologna process have very much been arguing along the lines of his yes, but. And that's really my main point here. Talking about change, I think we sometimes talk about change and transformation as we seem to talk about quality. It's something that's out there, and all we have to do is achieve it. I think it's very important to say change for what kind of change and why. If we don't do that, we risk playing into the hands of those who believe that the ivory tower was ever an apt metaphor for university. And I think that's exactly what the panel, especially Professor Noah and Sebastian Berger, have done. So in our public discourse, we need to talk about change of ourselves, change of how we can help societies change, but above all, we need to make the point that as this change for greater democracy, greater participation, greater inclusion. And I would like to take this opportunity also to thank the IAU for being such a great partner in the work that we're doing on the global cooperation for the democratic mission of higher education, and also in the Council of Europe's case, the IAU's input into our work on defining competences for a culture of democracy. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you to our speakers. I really appreciated the comments this morning very much. I'm Terry Balser. I'm the former provost at the University of Calgary, and I thought, coming back to your question about governments and government funding and the control, it occurred to me that it may be worth considering what might even be a trap of public funding. So we talk about wanting more, and in my experience as a chief budget officer of the university, there's a potential challenge there with government control that can be overt, but also covert. So there are performance metrics and there are reductions in government funding to the universities, which draw our focus. However, what we also discovered is that they're only too happy to give back money through grant programs specifically for things that they want. And what we discovered is that this was drawing us into the trap of losing control over our own strategic planning. What does strategic planning mean if we don't actually get to control what it is that we provide? So to me, that's an important question for us, is to think about, do we need to consider being willing to refuse money in order to maintain our autonomy? And sort of pose that, because it's something that I'm certainly considering as I think about how do we support all of this change and all of the need to transform higher education. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, and great question. My name is Svein Stølen. I'm the rector of the University of Oslo. And I think that Pamela is right. I think that the engagement with society has to be broader and more intense. And I think that we need to understand the politicians. They are going to talk to the citizens. So, I mean, they have to have the arguments they need in order to support universities. And of course, it's difficult to run a university. It's collective power based on individual freedom. That's quite a challenge, and we need to push that, of course. I think that the question we have to ask ourselves are whether we are leading or following. I think if you look at the COVID-19 situation, then that was the time when we managed to use digitalization. That was too late. When we now are pushed on foreign interference, it's because we haven't done enough, I guess. When we talk about lifelong learning, maybe have not been in the front seat. So I think that maybe that's the most important thing, to be in the front seat and then show value to the politicians. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to take two more questions, one at the back there and then one over here, and then we come back to the panel. Oh, gone past her. Sorry, it was over, sorry, back over here.
Hi, I'm Sophia. I work at the Association of Commonwealth Universities. And thank you so much for the participation of everyone that just jumped into the panel and discussing a lot on, you know, the role of universities to try to propagate democracy and how participatory they have to be. I guess I wanted to ask back to the panel a little bit on your experience. For instance, Sebastian, you're working in the Global Forum, and you have 122 countries represented. And to what extent can, you know, students that come from autocratic countries where this problem is even more prevalent actually voice your concerns to you? And to what extent do they have agencies within their own governments and universities to deal with that? And the same for Professor Antonio Nova. How does UNESCO try to put forward these values within the specific settings of, you know, autocracy? Thank you.
Thank you. I think there must have been actually two questions, two people next to each other over there, and we'll just take that Oh, sorry, and one final one from the aisle here, and then come back to the panel.
Thank you so much. I'm Darla Diodorf with the Association of International Education Administrators. Thank you to all the panelists for your very rich discussions. And I was struck, Sebastian, particularly in kind of picking up on the last comments on the student perspective, and really appreciate the organizers including that student perspective. Looking at the Futures of Education report from UNESCO, and also the 2030 future education that OECD is working on, there, particularly with the OECD one, there's a lot of emphasis on partnering with students of student agency. And it strikes me that when we look back through the history of higher education, students have been the ones leading the way. They're the ones putting themselves out there on the front line, so to speak, in preserving democracy and in promoting the values that we hold dear. And I'm wondering, particularly Sebastian, from your point of view, how would you see universities partnering with students? What can we do? What would you like to see happen in terms of partnering with students to really transform higher education as we know it? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so lady down here.
Thank you. Let me join others in congratulating the presenters. I have one aspect of sharing. I'm from Uganda. The issue of public funding in terms of being short-term rather than long-term, that's the limit transformation, because you are unable to think about these issues of inclusion, the issues of efficiency, all those participation, because of the short-term nature of the funding. So I think that's also very important, because you can't look to the future, very far in the future.
Thank you very much. So let's come back to the panel, and I think we'll go to Sebastian first, because there are a number of questions directed to him.
Thank you very much for these questions. I want to answer first to the point on how universities can be partners to students. And I'm going to answer it from the perspective of student unionism. So if you look at the global kind of field of student unions, the engagement and the quality of engagement of student unions on an international, national, and regional level varies greatly from one country to another, from one institution to another. And I think when we talk about the institutional engagement, student unions want to be engaged if it's meaningful. So student engagement in decision-making processes needs to have an impact on the actual outcomes of these decisions within an institution. And I think it also matters a lot what kind of students are involved, whether this is a top-down appointment by rectors, as we've seen it in some of the university alliances lately, or whether these are students that are elected by the students, that are accountable to the electorate and represent the voice of their constituency. And if they do not do it well, they won't be elected again. That is, I think, the fundamental idea of democracy. And another perspective to that is student unions often do not have a lot of funding, do not have a lot of space. I think if universities want to be allies to student organizations, there can be arrangements made where space is provided, where they are invited to important events like this. I think what the IAU is doing in their cooperation with student unions is one of the best practices on the international scene. But there are many universities who do that too very, very successfully. And I think these are the cases we need to look at. In regards to the question on student unions that are in the front line within authoritarian regimes, within countries and dictatorships in all parts of the world, what we are trying to do is to support them as much as possible with solidarity actions, with amplifying their messages, with providing a bigger stage to these voices effectively. If you look at Iran, if you look at Myanmar, if you look at Belarus, you cannot really do much as an advocacy organization, as a global union, besides petitioning relevant institutions. For us, that is the United Nations system. But basically raising their voices in important spaces. And I think another dimension to this, much more practical, and a very good example of how you can support students that are under the repression of regimes is the Student at Risk program, which is invented by Norway and done with SIDE, Norwegian Academics and International Assistance Fund, where student activists that face the consequences of their activism in such regimes get the opportunity to finish their studies in another country, in a different university. We have seen that a lot now with Belarus. Basically, the whole National Union of Students in Belarus is in exile, those who are not sitting in Lukashenko's prison. So it's a pretty hard world for student activists out there, and I think universities can be allies as much we as students need to be allies and bring light to these stories that should be kept in the dark by those who commit these crimes.
Okay, thank you. And Antonio, final comments.
Thank you. We have 1 hour more, or I think we have 2 or 3 minutes more. So I will try to react to some of the questions, not all, of course. And beginning with our colleague from Mexico, we have 4 days to change that situation, right? Until Sunday, as you tell. And in fact, in Brazil, it's the problem. The public universities in Brazil, the federal universities, they resisted very well in the last years, fortunately. But the big tragedy in Brazil is that 80%, I'm going to repeat, 80% of the students are educated in private institutions that are very bad. Not good private institutions, very bad private universities with 80% of the students are being educated there. And in these 80% of the students and the private universities, 90% are courses online. And this is the big tragedy of a country like Brazil and about what is higher education and what it means higher education. And that's why, that was the second question by our colleague from Sweden. Yes, the diversity is immense. We cannot compare these 80% of students that are being trained in very bad private universities with online courses with universities in Sweden or in some other country. And so diversity sometimes it's good, of course, but sometimes it's very unequal situations and very, very difficult situations in many of these countries. And the problem for me with the discourse, and I totally agree with you about the modernization agenda, is that we repeat these kind of ideas, the same kind of ideas, as if it was possible and if they represent the same thing in China, in the United States, in Portugal, in Sweden, in Brazil, and whatever. And I was very surprised when I made the merger of the 2 big universities in Lisbon, and it was my initiative. I read thousands, I would say thousands, of the strategic plans of universities. I spent months, years of my life reading these strategic plans, and they all repeated the same things. A small university with 2,000 students, right, in Africa or in Brazil, repeated exactly the same strategic plan of Harvard University or Stanford or Humboldt University or whatever. And that's what I would do. It was my intention to eliminate this kind of things so that we cannot go again in this kind of ideas that then are reproduced in the rankings and this kind of uniformity that it's not good for universities. We need different projects, different approaches. The universities are different, and that's what we need to say in terms of governance, because it was the other question. In terms of change, change does not mean the same thing in every country, in every situation, and in terms of governance also, and the way of keeping our autonomy, and that's for me the main point. So what I heard too many times in my country and around the world is that to be efficient, we cannot have participation. If you want to have a strong leadership, we cannot have the students in the governing bodies of our university, because it takes too long, there are too many discussions, it gives too many work, we cannot be efficient on that idea. And what I try to underline that it's not contradictory, that we can be both things and we need to be both things. Maybe in this moment of my life, it was our colleague from Oslo, in this moment of my life, I think that universities are not leading many changes. I think that we should do much better. And in many moments, we are not having this capacity of leading changes. And that's why I was talking about 250 million of students in the world. 250 million, 20,000 institutions is a lot. And it's strange for me that we are not leading this kind of what are the big issues of our societies that Sebastian was talking about democracy, about peace, about the common humanity, and also in terms of bringing the voice of young people. I see in many universities where I've been working that young people are not anymore interested by universities. I heard too much of my generation of people in Portugal with 30 years saying, I don't want to go to the university anymore. There are many other interesting things to do otherwise in other places and so I think we are in a certain losing our momentum, and that's why I think we need this kind of collective approach and to bring more of these young people. Of course, it's also a question of generations. It's also a question of the life expectancy. There are many other questions that are going on in terms of this debate, but I think that's the reason, because to stress the idea of transforming higher education is very important if we want to have this kind of transformative power. And of course, we need society to be with us. We need the young generations to be with us. We need curiosity. We need the scientists. We need the power of open science, of citizen science. We need this kind of link with societies. We talk about stakeholders. Of course, we need the stakeholders, but the problem for me is that sometimes when we use the concept of stakeholders, we are only thinking about economic stakeholders, and we need social movements, and we need the new generations, and we need this kind of participation. It's a crucial time for universities, and it's a crucial time also in terms of the discussions about digitalization, about the idea that everything can go online, and by the end, maybe one only university will serve all the world, because if it's online, maybe we can have a big university and we don't need 20,000 universities. And these are very difficult times for us, but also times that are very interesting in a sense. And so I think that we need to stress this idea of change, what kind of change, and that's what we are doing here. And it was for me a huge pleasure to be with you this morning. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. So I think you'll agree that we've had an excellent session this morning, looking at the transformations that we need to make to our universities, but the challenges that we'll have to overcome in order to make those transformations. So please join me once again in thanking our panel. Okay, so I just have a couple of housekeeping announcements.